What's up, dogs? Right into the review as always, and the verdict is not as clear on this one, as the macro capability works both for and against this lens. We'll jump into the macro part after we spend some time building this lens up with praise and then ripping into it. We have the good fortune of using my recent RF Rokinon 85mm review as a comparison at a similar price point, so buckle up. The non-L build is growing on me, not in the sense that I prefer it, but I like this build better than the non-L EF lenses. This lens is physically the big brother of the 35mm macro with an added limiter switch that we'll talk about in the macro section. The focus and control rings are both a bit chunkier with the extra barrel length. Love to see it. The mount is the same and the finishes are the same. We do interrupt this otherwise good news with a ding for a lack of weather sealing, but these lenses look damn fine together as a little prime family, and overall, I do like them all. I just picked up the 50 after previously renting it. That's a story for another time, perhaps the next video. You've got a filter size of 67mm, which differs from the 24-105 and 70-200, but no issue there if you're buying 82mm and 77mm filters. It's about the same weight as the Rokinon. If you aren't familiar with that, it's smack dab between the size and weight of the 35 and 24-105L. It feels very balanced on the R6, a bit front heavy on the RP, but most lenses do. Another winning RF lens on image quality, and I'm very happy with the images I was able to get during these 2 weeks. As usual, I feel like I've watched every other 85mm video on the planet in an attempt to distill info, approve or disprove others' claims. Not that anybody else's experience with this lens is invalid, but just as a way to add more comparison points. The consensus is that this lens shoots well above its price, if you will, and I would strongly agree. I have yet to do a solo review on the 35mm, and though I use that more for YouTube and less for stills, I find them similar in that respect. I do notice a little bit of purple fringing on both, but that's something that you might expect. It's also easily fixable. If you want to get rid of that in camera and stay razor sharp at even wider apertures, then you have the 1.2 upgrade path on the 85s, 2 flavors of it. And we should have those same upgrade paths for the 35 as well, hopefully sometime in 2022. While not an f1.8 like the 35 and 50, this is ready to start blasting wide open at f2, and you can get some really good image quality starting there. You're not getting image stabilization on the big f1.2s, you're not getting it on the Rokinon f1.4, but reminiscent of the 35mm macro again, you are gonna get image stabilization on this f2. In the Rokinon video, I think I said I didn't really miss it as a photo-first shooter. It was going to be blasting things away at f1.4. I want the image stabilization on the lens if it exists, but for me, this is a photo-first bokeh blaster, and I don't necessarily require that. The Canon 85mm f2, that semi-macro lens, does have image stabilization, but because this is an f2 instead of an f1.4, I do appreciate the inclusion of the image stabilization here. And I think it's smart that Canon included that for the price that they're charging. It's also going to be helpful for macro work if you plan to lean heavily into that, or especially if you're going to use this on the RP without IBIS that you might have on the R6. Also, the f1.4 without image stabilization versus the f2 with image stabilization, it's probably a toss-up in terms of the amount of light these lenses are going to be able to gather. I'm not sure what that works out to be exactly, and it will also depend if you have IBIS or not in the RP or R6 and R5. But on the Rokinon, you'll need to use faster shutter speeds. Before we hit some drawbacks, I'm going to toss in the prices being good as well. At $600, it's a bit cheaper than the Rokinon or Samyang versions, but you'll have to come out of pocket for a hood. I'm calling this a good value for the IQ to price ratio. If it shipped with a hood or shot f1.8, it'd be even a better steal. You also won't need the hard-to-find lens station that you need with the Rokinon to update firmware. If you are looking for that, Lens Rentals actually started carrying that lens dock after my conversations with them when I rented the 85 earlier. So count on them to hook you up as I always do with the link below. 2 negatives on the body, one of which is the lack of weather sealing. Some people don't care. I care a lot. I like going out to shoot in the rain and snow. It rained a few times on the trip that I took this on, and so I kept inside. It's just a bigger downer not to have weather sealing now that I'm using the R6. The other thing is the lack of internal focus. This doesn't annoy me as much as the lack of weather sealing, but I'd prefer that the front of the lens didn't protrude on the 85 and 35mm when focusing. Now this is the big one, and it will lead us into the macro discussion and who this lens is best for. Some people complain the Rokinon would miss focus, but I had great results personally. This lens doesn't necessarily miss focus that often, but it does take longer to get there. Sometimes we'll arrive at that focus in a jerky, hunting way, and it's not the quietest. The sound is the least of my worries, and like a lot of lenses, the focus slows down in video mode to be quieter. The 35 is actually a little bit louder, I think. The 50 is a little bit quieter, but both the 35 and 50 are snappier to focus, the 35 a good bit more so. I find this to be a bummer because it's the first departure from the other RF lenses that I've rented. It happens because of the macro capability, and I don't know if it quite gets to the point of frustration for me, but it definitely took me out of that flow feeling a few times in a way that the Rokinon didn't. Those who shoot weddings seem hesitant to trust this, and while I don't shoot weddings, I don't blame them either. So there are two groups that I would still excitedly recommend this lens for. If you're choosing between the affordable 85s only, the first big decider for Group A is whether or not you'll use the macro capability. With the 1:2 macro, you can focus a lot closer than you can with the Rokinon. If this is the most important criterion for you, then you get a great sharp lens with macro capability, and the choice is pretty simple. I didn't really understand the concept of a 1:2 macro for an embarrassingly long time, but both the 35 and the 85 are 1:2 macros, meaning that they both can represent images up to half the size of the sensor. Despite the fact that the 85 is a longer focal length, the 35 is a closer focusing distance. So you can see that they can both get equally tight on a quarter, for example, at their respective minimum focusing distances. A true 1:1 can represent objects at life size, so the EF100 can get much closer. The 85 does have a focus limiter like I mentioned, so theoretically, that helps with some of the hunting and focusing issues. In the 2 weeks that I had the lens, I wasn't able to get familiar enough with it to use it fast enough to really truly benefit in the moment. I'm sure you would slowly get better with it as time went on, but it's not going to be a magic bullet. And so that behavior is just sort of typical of macro lenses in general. The EF100 has some similar issues when it starts focusing in the wrong direction initially. For Group B, I think it's also a great lens if you don't have an RF lens that's faster, if you think you like shooting on the long end, and you're maybe looking for your second or third lens. If you have either of the 24-105 kit lenses, this would pair nicely with those if you like shooting long, and it's going to be a massive image quality improvement over the non-L 24-105. Alternatively, something to consider is that the Nifty 50 is going to get you a lot of the same advantages that I'm talking about for a fraction of the cost at an incredible size. If I go 85, it's going to be the Rokinon or one of the big 1.2 lenses far in the future. But if you're still undecided, take one for a spin.